Morning misery and coal dust you awaken to the sharp, stale air of a drawing room just barely warmed by a dying coal fire. It's a London townhouse. Somewhere around the 1870s, the floorboards creak under your feet as you rise. No central heating. Of course, only what you manage to keep burning in the hearth overnight. And judging by the crust of frost edging the single-pane windows, you didn't manage much. The bedclothes are damp with condensation from your own breath. Before you even rise to greet the day, you are already colder than you've likely ever been indoors. Welcome to Victorian comfort. The day begins early in this house. Whether you like it or not, if you were part of the middle or upper classes, you might have a servant to stoke the fires before you woke. But if you're not wealthy or worse, you're a servant yourself, then you are the one hauling coal before dawn. Coal is not delivered in tidy bags. It's kept in a dusty bin somewhere out back, often near the outdoor privy. You fill your scuttle, bringing black dust and soot back inside with you. Your hands, face, and clothing are smudged within minutes. There is no escaping the grime. Your first task is probably boiling water. The Victorian house had no hot taps. Every bit of warm water had to be boiled manually, whether for bathing, shaving, scrubbing dishes, or steeping tea. And since even the water itself came from a hand pump, if you were lucky enough to have one inside, you're hauling that too. No wonder the average Victorian didn't wash as often as we think. For working class families, a weekly bath was more typical, often shared among siblings. The oldest went first, the youngest got the murky remains. Don't throw the baby out with the bath water was more than just a phrase, it reflected a real risk. Even in the better neighborhoods, household work was relentless and manual. Housewives were expected to polish the hearths, sweep the floors, and beat the rugs with a stick outside. Dust was a constant enemy. Due to the open fireplaces and soot-belching city air, coal smoke darkened the walls, ruined fabrics, and filled lungs. There were no vacuum cleaners, carpets were nailed down, mattresses were turned every week, chimneys needed to be swept. And yes, until the late 19th century, this often meant sending small boys up into the flue. You might think breakfast would be a reward after all that labor. But again, it's not what you're used to. There are no cereals, no refrigeration. Milk is delivered by the milkman and pasteurized, carried in open cans, and often watered down by the time it reaches your house. Bread comes from the local baker, and if you're poor, it might contain bits of chalk or alum to stretch the flour. Meat, if you can afford it, was probably kept in a meat-safe and airy wooden box, with mesh sides or salted to preserve it. Eggs are fresh, but only in season, and butter. If you're not churning it yourself, you're buying it loose from a local seller, who may or may not be honest about its freshness. The most common breakfast: cold meat, bread, porridge. No fruit unless it's been preserved, or you're wealthy. Now comes the question of dress. Victorian clothing was stiff, layered, and utterly impractical by modern standards. You'd need help to get dressed properly: corsets for women, multiple petticoats, and binding bodices. For men, it meant undershirts, waistcoats, starch collars, cravats, and heavy wool coats. And shoes, let's not forget, were hard-soled and designed for durability, not comfort. If you're a child, your clothing is often uncomfortable and indistinct from adult attire. And remember, no synthetic fibers. All garments were wool, linen, or cotton, and they were scratchy, heavy, and incredibly difficult to clean. You've been awake for 3 hours, and already the soot, cold, and endless chores have worn you down. But the day has barely begun. For most Victorian households, whether middle class or working class, the majority of daytime hours were devoted to labor. If you were a woman, you were expected to remain within the domestic sphere, sewing, mending, preserving food, tending children, and possibly doing laundry, an ordeal that involved grating soap, boiling water over a coal range, and using a hand wringer to squeeze it all dry. Ironing was done with heavy flat-irons heated on the stove. There were no thermostats, no electric kettles, no microwaves. Everything required time, muscle, and usually a great deal of steam. Still, let's say you live in an urban home with some means. You have a servant or one. Then there are rules. Etiquette governs everything, from how you address your employer to the exact angle at which you curtsy. Meals are served formally, and even minor infractions of behavior could get you dismissed. Letters are written daily, and they're sealed with wax. You eat dinner in your best clothes, by candlelight or gas lamp, and if you're upstairs while others work downstairs, you are expected never to acknowledge them unless through formal channels. It is a house divided by silence and service. Meanwhile, diseases lurk quietly in every corner. The plumbing is rudimentary at best, and most houses still relied on outdoor toilets, privies that might be emptied only once a week. Chamber pots were normal upstairs, and if you were a servant, emptying those was part of your job. Germ theory was just beginning to take hold, but many still believed that miasma's bad air is the cause of disease. This meant heavy curtains and poor ventilation were seen as protections, rather than the hazards they were. Respiratory illness, typhoid, and cholera were all part of daily life. At this point, you might think a walk outside would be a relief, but unless you live in the countryside, stepping outside meant plunging into a noisy, grimy, dangerous world. The streets were filled with horse dung, mud, and smoke. The air smelled of sulfur and coal. Crossing the road meant dodging carriages and carts, and while gas lamps lit the wealthier neighborhoods, poorer streets were often pitch black at night. It's still only midday. So, the question becomes, would you have survived, truly survived, the minute-by-minute demands of just a single Victorian day? Would your lungs have adjusted, your patience held, your spine endured the corset or collar? Or is it possible that the real miracle of the 19th century wasn't steam power or empire, but the sheer human stamina required to live in these homes? By midday, the Victorian home is not calmer, it's louder. Industrial Britain didn't offer much peace and quiet. If you live in a city, the cacophony of street sellers, clanging horse carriages, and distant factory whistles became your background music. Even in respectable homes, the walls were thin, the neighbors close, and the children loud. And if you happened to be one of the countless maids, nannies, cooks, or laundresses, the afternoon brought no break, only more heat, more soot, and a relentless parade of duties. Victorian houses did not run themselves. They were living organisms powered by invisible, underpaid labor. Let's imagine again that you're a middle-class woman, recently dressed, having finally finished breakfast. You might be lucky enough to sit down with your needlework, but even then, the house demands your supervision. You must monitor the cook's preparation for supper, check the state of the linens, supervise the polishing of the brass stair rail, and ensure that the coal scuttles are filled. You'd also be writing letters endlessly, since the Victorian era was an age of correspondence. An educated woman might write several per day. There was no phone, no text. Arranging the simple social visit required careful planning by post, sometimes over the course of a week or more. The home, if you're not in the servant class, was your entire world. The phrase angel in the house wasn't metaphor, it was instruction. You were expected to embody moral purity, restraint, patience, and domestic perfection. If the soup was too thin or the lace was wrinkled, it reflected poorly on your virtue. It was not unusual for women to faint from corset pressure or exhaustion, or a mix of both. Afternoon rest was allowed, but only if you had already performed all expected duties, and even then it was considered a mark of privilege for those who worked in the home, especially the general maid or maid of all work. There was no such thing as rest. Afternoons were laundry time, stove cleaning time, or sometimes blacking the grates with soot polish, a filthy, time-consuming process. Laundry alone could take an entire day, and was one of the most punishing tasks in the household. Without machines, clothes were soaked, scrubbed, boiled, beaten, wrung out, starched, and ironed. The heat from the copper boiler made the kitchen into a steam-filled chamber, where women worked in soaked dresses with blistered fingers. Even simple tasks were made harder by the materials of the age. Soap was harsh and caustic, especially the lye-based varieties. You might develop red, cracked hands or chemical burns. Ironing used flat irons heated on the range, sometimes dangerously hot, with no heat regulation. And they were heavy, too, often 5 to 7 pounds each. If you drop one, it could break a tile or your toe. And what of the children, if you were of means? A nurse or nanny might tend to them, walking them in stiff outfits through the park with strict instructions not to smile too much or play too freely. Toys were few, and playtime was often formalized. Discipline was a constant. Children were expected to be silent in company, upright at all times, and obedient. In poorer homes, children had no nannies and certainly no toys. Instead, they had chores. A boy of 7 might be delivering messages, helping haul coal, or selling papers. A girl might already be caring for siblings. The romantic image of Victorian childhood as innocent and carefree was a rare luxury. Now let's talk about food. Safety. You've already had your watered-down milk in the morning. For lunch, you might enjoy bread and cheese or cold meat, but food quality was hit or miss. Adulteration was rampant. Tea might be mixed with used tea leaves, dried and dyed to look fresh. Sugar was sometimes stretched with sand or chalk. Beer could be laced with copper sulfate to make it fizz more. Bread was whitened with alum, which caused stomach issues. There was no FDA, no standard food inspections until later in the 19th century. Even respectable grocers could sell unsafe food. Most of the cooking was done with coal or wood stoves, without thermometers or timers. Recipes often read, "Bake until done," which sounds simple until you realize the entire oven was a mystery. Box of variable heat and ash. Meat was turned on a spit, vegetables boiled until mush, and spices were minimal, despite what TV period dramas suggest. Victorian cuisine was generally bland, practical, and deeply repetitive. The average dinner might involve mutton stew, boiled potatoes, and bread. Again, the dangers extended beyond the kitchen. Household accidents were frequent and often deadly. Candles set curtains ablaze. Gas lighting, though newer, sometimes leaked or exploded. Children fell into uncovered hearths or scalding tubs. Chimney flues caught fire. Floors warped with water damage, and many staircases lacked railings. Even wealthier homes had no fire escapes. The death rate from domestic accidents, especially for women and children, was tragically high. Even simple hygiene was a risk. Water could be contaminated, especially before widespread filtration and sewer improvements. Toilets, if you had them, were often poorly sealed. Many homes still relied on earth closets, basically indoor outhouses, or the good old chamber pot. The smell could be unbearable, and the spread of disease was inevitable. Victorian London suffered multiple cholera outbreaks because of this, with some neighborhoods experiencing hundreds of deaths in a single week. It wasn't until the work of John Snow and the eventual overhaul of sewer systems under Joseph Bazalgette that the tide began to turn. An illness wasn't treated with much more comfort than the house itself. Medicine was in its awkward adolescence. Bleeding and purging were still in use early in the period. Mercury-based treatments were common. Opium was used liberally, including in children's teething syrups. Patent medicines offered bold promises and caused bold problems. There were female restorative tonics full of alcohol and morphine, cough syrups packed with chloroform. If you fell ill, you might be bled, dosed with laudanum, or offered a plaster made of mustard powder and vinegar. Let's not forget clothing again, because you're still wearing it. Multiple layers in summer, heavy boots in winter, all tightened, with buttons and stays. Women's corsets restricted breathing, crushed internal organs, and distorted ribs. Men's collars could be stiff enough to cause neck abrasions. Children's clothing was itchy, restricting, and usually secondhand. Changing clothes was an ordeal, especially when you had to lace, hook, pen, and type by hand. Now imagine you had to do all this while menstruating, pregnant, or sick. Sanitary products were rudimentary or homemade. There was no middle, no heating pads, and no sick leave. If you were a servant, you worked regardless. If you were a mistress of the house, your pain was expected to be hidden. Victorian ideals glorified female suffering as a virtue. By now, it's 5 p.m. You've endured cold, soot, hunger, burns, disease risk, uncomfortable clothing, and social rigidity. But the worst part, the unrelenting expectation, you were never off duty. There was no concept of leisure as we know it today. Even reading a book had to be edifying. Even walks were often segregated by class, and speech by etiquette. As the sun begins to set behind a yellow haze of industrial smoke, you may wonder, how did anyone endure this lifestyle for decades? Was it simply habit, lack of choice, or was it something more, something deeper in the human capacity to adapt, endure, and call even this home? Evening in a Victorian house was not, as you might hope, a time of peace. For most, it marked simply the beginning of another routine, one that was every bit as constraining as the day. In fact, nighttime exposed the full weight of Victorian expectations. If you thought the day was difficult, the night brought new discomforts: poor lighting, hard beds, punishing silence, and the lurking fear of fire, burglary, or illness in the dark. Even sleep, in the Victorian world, was a discipline, orchestrated act. As gas lamps flickered on or candles were lit, you might think the glow of light meant warmth. But most houses were cold, unless you were wealthy enough to afford multiple fireplaces or live-in staff to stoke them. Only 1 or 2 rooms would be heated. Bedrooms were notoriously icy, especially for servants, who often slept in attics, basements, or near kitchens. Anywhere space could be spared. Blankets were heavy, not always clean, and made of wool that scratched the skin. Some people slept in their day clothing just to keep warm. And yet, the bedroom wasn't private, not really. For many working-class homes, multiple family members shared a single bed. Sometimes children, parents, and even boarders slept together, head to toe, to conserve heat. In more modest middle-class homes, the walls were thin and noise easily carried. Privacy was more of an idea than a reality. One's virtue was expected to be maintained regardless of the conditions. Now, let's revisit the idea of the Victorian sleep cycle. Contrary to modern practice, many Victorians practiced what's known as segmented sleep. People would go to bed shortly after dusk, wake for an hour or two in the middle of the night to pray, read, or tend to the fire, and then return to bed until dawn. The concept of 8 straight hours of uninterrupted sleep was unusual, and for servants, the night often included labor, rising before dawn to relight stoves, or fetch water for morning routines. Hygiene before bed was minimal. A servant might bring you a basin of lukewarm water. You'd wash your face and hands, no hot shower, no soap for sensitive skin, and no running water unless you lived in a modernized urban home with plumbing still rare in most houses before 1900. Toileting remained awkward. Chamber pots were standard, emptied in the morning. Some homes had night commodes, wooden cabinets that hid the pot, but the smell was unmistakable. If you were lucky, a servant would discreetly handle it. If not, you might carry it down yourself. And then there were the sounds: creaking floorboards, wind against the glass, the far-off groan of factory whistles or church bells marking the hour. Burglary was a real concern. Locks were primitive, windows easily breached, and the streets unsafe after dark in many cities. Poor lighting meant shadows stretched long, and gas lighting could hiss, flicker, or fail entirely. It was not uncommon for Victorian children to fear being left alone after dark, or even adults, especially in towns where night-soiled men and late-night drunkards still roamed. Disease, too, prowled the night. The air was believed to carry illness, miasma, so windows were often kept shut tight. Despite the coal smoke that lingered indoors, ventilation was poor. Coughing in the night, especially if chronic, might indicate something far worse, tuberculosis, which was rampant. Life insurance companies tracked the number of people per room in a household to assess risk. It was common for disease to spread through the very air you breathed, especially at night. And yet, for the wealthier class, the illusion of elegance persisted. The parlor might still glow with gaslight. Guests might arrive for dinner, a multi-course ordeal with strict etiquette, hosted over several hours. There were specific rules about seating arrangements, proper color use, and the order of dishes: soup, fish, meat, pudding, cheese, fruit, and nuts, ideally in that order. Wine pairings were expected. Conversation had its own protocols. And once dinner ended, the women retired to the drawing room while the men stayed behind to drink and discuss politics. This wasn't leisure. It was performance. A domestic theater where every movement, every phrase, every facial expression reinforced your place in society. For the lower classes, meanwhile, supper might consist of reheated stew and stale bread. Many homes lacked enough chairs, so people stood or ate from their laps. The meal was short, functional, not leisurely. And afterward, if you weren't already in bed, you might mend clothes, clean boots, or prepare for the next day's work. In Victorian households, nighttime was never really off. Books, if you had them, offered some comfort, but reading was a luxury. Literacy increased throughout the 19th century, especially after the Education Acts of 1870 and 1880, which made schooling mandatory for younger children in England. But books remained expensive. Penny dreadfuls, cheap, serialized stories offered dark amusement for the working class, though they were condemned as immoral by polite society. The well-off preferred Dickens, Trollope, or moral biographies, but everyone read by dim light. Straining eyes with no ergonomic furniture, no eye drops, no optometrist for the poor, still awake. Let's check the bed again. You lie on a horsehair mattress, slumpy, itchy, and barely soft. Your pillow is stuffed with straw or down, depending on status. The sheets haven't been changed in a week. The window is shut tight, the fire long out. Your body aches from rigid clothing. Your lungs sting from coal dust. And your brain hums with worry of bills, of illness, of social disgrace. And as you try to drift into a restless sleep, your nose picks up the faint but persistent scent of wax, wool, and chamber pot. This claustrophobic world of routines and rigid codes, of discomfort treated as moral fortitude, was considered normal, even ideal. The Victorian house wasn't just a building. It was a machine built on expectation, powered by silent labor, and held together by a kind of fragile discipline. Every surface was polished, but every corner hid anxiety. Every dinner was civil, but laced with social tension. Every bed was made, but rarely truly restful. And yet, millions lived this way for decades. Some thrived, others collapsed. Most endured because that was what one did. Survival wasn't defined by strength or wealth alone, but by how well you could internalize the system and keep the machine running. Now that you've endured your first, and likely only 24 hours in a Victorian house, ask yourself, was it the hardship that made it unbearable? Or was it the quiet, inescapable weight of expectation? And how many modern comforts do we take for granted that, even today, were once luxuries known only to the most privileged? Morning routines, Roman mouths, and the power of spit you wait before dawn. The light hasn't quite pierced through the small slits of the wooden shutters in your modest domus in the suburbs crowded and noisy working-class district. It's hot. The air is thick with the smell of oil, wool, stale bread, and the ever-present hint of sewage. The streets are already groaning awake with the sound of street vendors preparing their carts, chamber pots being emptied from second-story windows, and roosters competing with the clatter of sandals on stone. Your first act, not breakfast, not bathing. You go straight to your mouth, brushing your teeth, as a concept existed in Rome. But if you're imagining a toothbrush or paste, discard that image. The Romans didn't brush as we do. They scrubbed, rinsed, and spat. Oral care was less about fresh breath and more about ritual, superstition, and strange materials, many of which would make modern dentists wince. The most common item used to clean the teeth wasn't a brush but a rag, often made of linen. Sometimes it was wrapped around a finger and dipped into a mixture of powdered charcoal, crushed bones, oyster shells, or pumice stone. These gritty powders, known as dentifrices, were believed to whiten the teeth and scour away the remains of last night's meal. Figs, goat cheese, garum fermented fish sauce, and perhaps some watered-down wine. The taste of these scrubbing agents, bitter, salty, and sometimes vaguely metallic. Upper-class Romans might add myrrh or dried mint leaves to the mix if they could afford it. Scent mattered, even in the mouth. But the average Roman wasn't brushing for many breath. They were doing it to appear civilized. To be Roman was to be clean, not necessarily by our standards, but by the very specific expectations of a culture that bathed in communal baths and valued outward hygiene, even if internal sanitation was still a mystery. And then there was the urine. Yes, truly, one of the most common substances used to clean Roman teeth, especially in later imperial times, was Portuguese urine. It was considered premium. Why? Because of its ammonia content, which served as a bleaching agent. It was widely believed to whiten the teeth and sanitize the mouth. Merchants even imported it to Rome, and it was taxed under Emperor Vespasian, who famously quipped that money does not stink pecunia non olet when criticized for the tax. Romans rinsed with it, gargled, swished, and spat. Imagine the sting. The sharp, acrid bite of aged ammonia against your gums and bleeding. Some receding from malnutrition or early gum disease. There were no dentists in the modern sense. Barber surgeons or specialist slaves might offer extractions, but prevention was largely up to you, your household traditions, and your willingness to tolerate grit, bile, or bodily fluids. Now, remember, dental decay in ancient Rome was not as rampant as in sugar-fed medieval or modern societies. Their diet, high in rough bread, legumes, and vegetables, was less carcinogenic. But still, they suffered from tooth wear, abrasions, and plaque buildup, which calcified into dental calculus over time. The wear patterns found in Roman skulls suggest a population familiar with grinding, chewing, and damage from abrasive powders. Molars often show signs of enamel loss, and without floss, food debris often lingered in the gaps, inviting infection. To deal with dental pain, Romans turned to herbs, and poultices. Clove was unknown, but they had asafoetida, garlic, and onion, all believed to relieve swelling. Some chewed myrtle leaves or applied fig sap to aching teeth. For swelling or gum disease, they might apply a poultice of crushed barley and honey, or rinse with vinegar infused with salt or ashes. Let's step into the kitchen. A young boy is preparing the family's morning mouth rinse. He's grinding pumice stone and burned goat bones in a mortar, mixing it with vinegar. This isn't toothpaste, it's a kind of abrasive slurry. The master of the house dips his finger in it and rubs it along his teeth with a practiced motion. His gums bleed. A little. He spits, wipes his mouth, and then prepares for the rest of his day, believing himself clean. And what of bad breath? Romans were obsessed with it. They called it fodor oris, a foul-smelling mouth, and it was a mark of moral decay as much as physical illness. Writers like Pliny the Elder and Martial took potshots at people with bad breath. It was considered an insult not just to health, but to dignity. Remedies included chewing parsley, cardamom, cinnamon, and even simmered mice soaked in wine, though the last one was likely reserved for the fringes of society or the desperately superstitious. Teeth whitening was also a cosmetic goal, especially for courtesans, elite women, and public speakers. A clean mouth reflected a clean soul. Cicero, in his orations, emphasized the importance of presentation, and it's likely that breath and tooth appearance mattered when standing in front of a crowd. Public figures were expected to maintain a clean front, well-groomed hair, oiled skin, and a presentable mouth. Yet even among the elite, tooth loss was common. Archaeological digs in Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Roman Britain have uncovered skeletons missing front teeth, often replaced with nothing or in rare cases, with gold or ivory prosthetics. More decorative than functional, these weren't fixed in the mouth with adhesives, but worn like status markers. By midday, the dentifrice powders are back out. Romans didn't just clean their teeth in the morning, they often did so after meals, especially among the wealthy or those hosting guests. Think of it like ancient mouthwash culture, abrasive, smelly, and thoroughly Roman. But perhaps the most surprising part of Roman oral care is how public and normalized it was. Unlike today, where brushing is private, Romans often cleaned their mouths in communal baths, at public fountains, or during visits with friends. The act itself was not taboo, it was another ritual of Roman civility, another way to perform the role of a proper citizen. In a world where outward appearance meant everything, as you step out into the bright Roman street, your mouth tingling with vinegar, ash, and possibly a trace of stale urine. Consider this: in a city filled with marble, power, and pageantry, even your teeth were a battlefield of social status, belief, and daily endurance. But what happens when tooth pain becomes unbearable? What did the Romans do when home remedies failed and the ache cut deep into the jaw? You're still in Rome, its marble columns gleaming in the Mediterranean light, its cobbled alleys teeming with bakers, fishmongers, and sandal makers. But something has changed. You've developed a toothache, not a mild annoyance, but a deep, relentless throbbing at the back of your jaw. It's hard to chew, hard to sleep, hard to think. There's no escaping it, not even inside the grand Roman bathhouses, not at the temples, and certainly not during long Senate debates or family banquets. The pain follows you like a curse. In ancient Rome, toothaches were not just physical annoyances, they were warnings. The Romans didn't understand bacteria or nerve damage. They believed pain in the mouth might be caused by toothworms, evil spirits, or imbalances in bodily fluids, the famous for humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If one was out of balance, suffering followed. What did you do if cleaning your teeth with vinegar and powdered bone didn't solve the problem? You sought help, but it wasn't from a dentist, at least not in the way we'd imagine one today. Rome had no formal dental profession, but there were people, sometimes barbers, sometimes traveling specialists, sometimes even enslaved individuals, trained in medical arts who offered solutions. The most common, extraction. Tooth pulling in ancient Rome was a brutal, improvised business. The tools weren't made for comfort. Imagine iron tongs, bone levers, or crude forceps heated in fire to sterilize them. If you were lucky, there were no numbing agents, no sedation, just strong hands and a firm grip. Roman philosopher and naturalist Celsus, writing in the 1st century CE, described some of the basic procedures. He advised loosening the tooth first, possibly by rocking it with a finger or hook. If the gum was inflamed, you'd cut it open. Then, using a metal instrument, the tooth was twisted or yanked from the jaw. He also recommended rinsing the wound with vinegar or salt water to prevent festering. The danger wasn't just the pain. Infection from dirty tools or untreated wounds was a real threat. Without antibiotics, an infected socket could lead to fever, swelling, or worse, osteomyelitis, a severe bone infection. There are records of people dying from untreated dental abscesses, their mouths swollen shut, their airways obstructed. Sometimes, patients weren't willing to risk extraction. In those cases, Romans turned to healing rituals and superstitions. Amulets were popular. One might wear a pendant of ivory, coral, or even an animal tooth, hoping it would absorb the pain. Incantations were whispered over aching gums. Healers might chant spells while pressing herbs into the mouth. And in some back streets of Rome, there were still those who believed in the power of bloodletting, draining blood from the arm or neck to relieve mouth pain. by balancing the humors. Another remedy, cauterization, yes, burning the infected area with a hot iron rod. It sounds barbaric, and it was. But for some Romans, this was preferable to a toothache that had lasted for days. The heat, they believed, could kill whatever malevolent force lurked within the gum dot, and then there were herbal narcotics, not anesthesia. Exactly. But sedatives, opium, derived from the poppy plant, was known to Roman doctors. Mixed with wine or crushed into a paste, it could dull the senses. Mandrake root, henbane, and belladonna were also used in various medicinal potions. Dangerous in large amounts, but effective enough to calm an agitated patient. Still, the line between medicine and myth was thin. In the countryside, toothaches were treated with folk magic, a dog's tooth buried under the threshold of a house, or a string tied to a dying man's jaw. There are even accounts, perhaps exaggerated, of Romans believing that spitting on a toad at midnight would banish mouth pain. But not all Roman tooth care was crisis-driven. Wealthier citizens, especially women and performers, invested in cosmetic dental maintenance long before the modern obsession with straight white smiles. White teeth were admired, though more often seen in youth than in age. Some wealthier Romans paid for tooth replacements, not implants, but removable dentures made from animal bone, ivory, or even human teeth. These were carved to fit the gap, and sometimes affixed with gold wire. They weren't always functional, but they helped preserve appearances. There was even a social hierarchy to tooth care. The elite might access Greek-trained physicians who had more advanced understandings of medicine and anatomy. Poorer citizens, meanwhile, relied on barbers, street medics, or home remedies passed down from grandmother to daughter. The distinction wasn't just in quality, it was in safety. Despite the tools and tinctures, the average Roman's mouth wasn't a picture of health. Diet played a role. While they consumed far less sugar than post-Columbian civilizations, Roman bread was notoriously hard, baked with stone-ground flour. It often contained grit from millstones, which slowly wore down enamel, combined with acidic wine, coarse vegetables, and salty meats. Teeth suffered. Analysis of Roman skeletons shows widespread tooth abrasion and jawbone loss, especially among the working classes. The literary world also reflected this reality. Roman writers like Martial and Juvenal frequently mocked people for their missing or rotting teeth, associating them with poverty, gluttony, or laziness. Toothlessness became a sign of age, decay, or moral failing, and yet, for all their discomforts, the Romans were pioneers. Their recipes for dentifrices were copied and modified through the centuries. Their belief in oral hygiene is a sign of civilization endured, and their tools, crude though they were, laid the groundwork for later dental innovations. In the Islamic world and medieval Europe, as the sun sets over the rooftops of ancient Rome, and your aching jaw finally settles into a wine-soaked haze of sleep, a question lingers in your mind. If Roman tooth care was so brutal, why did their practices survive for so long, even being adopted by later empires? You're waking again, this time not from sleep, but from a slow drift backward through history. The pain in your tooth is a memory now. The smell of vinegar and ashes has faded, and yet, the daily rhythms of Roman oral care still echo in how we treat our teeth today. Because while Roman dentistry was rough and unsophisticated, it was also the beginning, the start of something that modern civilization has refined but never quite replaced. In the 3rd century CE, the city of Rome was nearing its imperial peak. Its population swelled to over 1 million, and the infrastructure creaked under the weight. But hygiene, odd as it may seem in a world without antibiotics, remained a priority. Public baths, latrines, aqueduct-fed fountains, and regulated waste removal were all designed to keep the city's reputation of sophistication intact. And oral care, though often carried out in private homes or small shops, was considered part of a Roman's personal hygiene regimen. It wasn't just personal vanity. There was legal and professional incentive too. A Roman senator with fetid breath might lose favor. An orator with missing teeth could lose a case. A courtesan with yellowing molars could lose clients. The mouth was a performance space in ancient Roma's site of speech, social grace, and sensuality. By the late Empire, manuals of medicine began to more systematically document oral care practices. One of the most referenced works is by Galen, the influential Greek physician whose ideas shaped Roman and later medieval medical thinking for centuries. Galen believed in balancing humors but also emphasized diet and cleanliness as central to health. He recommended rinsing the mouth after meals and avoiding foods that were sticky or likely to linger between the teeth. He noted how garlic and onions could strengthen or inflame the gums depending on their preparation. Even the act of chewing, he suggested, was part of health maintenance. These ideas, passed from Latin to Arabic to medieval Latin again, laid the groundwork for early medical schools in Salerno and Montpellier. The gritty powders of the Romans became the first prototypes for tooth powders in the Islamic Golden Age, many of which used ingredients like crushed coral, cloves, and camphor, not so different from the Roman mixtures of charcoal and mint. Islamic physicians such as al-Zairawi described dental tools in more advanced detail, introducing designs that were safer and more precise than the Roman iron tongs and fire-warmed hooks. And yet, despite all the innovation that followed, the Roman legacy persisted. Even into the Renaissance, powdered pumice remained in use. Toothpicks common in Roman homes and found as small bronze instruments. And archaeological digs never went away. They evolved from gold and ivory luxury items to common accessories in medieval and early modern households. Curiously, the most enduring Roman dental product wasn't a tool but a substance: urine. Long after the fall of Rome, urine continued to be used in Europe for teeth whitening. By the 16th and 17th centuries, chamber age urine was recommended in various medical manuals. And not just for oral health, it was suggested for treating gum disease, toothaches, and even ulcers. Physicians like Paracelsus defended its use. And while its popularity waned with the rise of more refined dental practices in the 18th and 19th centuries, the science behind ammonia as a cleanser remains valid even today. But why did Roman oral care stick around for so long? Despite its crudeness, the answer lies in a principle that still shapes medical practice. What works lasts. Even without understanding bacteria, Roman cleaning methods did reduce plaque. Abrasives, though harsh, help prevent serious infections. Vinegar acted as an antiseptic. Mouthwashes freshened breath, however briefly. The rituals themselves daily maintenance, rinsing after meals, and oral hygiene as a reflection of identity were internalized across centuries. Not because Romans were particularly wise, but because they were observant. They connected cleanliness with health and reputation, and they built habits that could survive the collapse of an empire. Now, step outside the Roman house one last time. You pass a vendor selling figs and honey cakes, a woman mixing resin with oil to sell as perfume, and a slave boy sweeping dust from a marble step. In the distance, a physician is lecturing under the colonnade of a public building, holding up a jawbone and pointing out the roots of a molar. And you realize everything that's ever happened in your bathroom mirror each morning: brushing, rinsing, checking your smile has ancient echoes, not because Rome had perfect knowledge, but because it tried. It tried to solve the unsolvable: how to live in a decaying body, in a messy world, with dignity. So tonight, when you swirl your minty rinse and spit into porcelain, ask yourself, what parts of our own routines will seem just as strange 2,000 years from now? Why you regret getting a haircut in medieval Europe? You step into a medieval European village just after sunrise. The sky is dull pewter, and the smell of wood smoke and mud fills the air. You haven't had a haircut in weeks. Your beard itches. Your head sweats under layers of thick, unkempt hair. It's time. You decide for some grooming. But there's no salon, no appointment, no mirror-framed room with gentle music. Instead, You head toward a narrow timber-framed building just off the market square, where a painted pole outside spirals red and white. That's the sign of the barber surgeon, an ordinary man with a sharp blade, steady hand, and a willingness to deal with blood. The barber shop isn't a shop, really. It's a dim room, maybe attached to a tavern or crammed into the back of a grocer's stall. The scent of sweat hangs in the air, mixed with the iron tang of dried blood. Flies buzz lazily over a table where razors, shears, and blunt iron tools lie in a dish of cloudy water. A worn wooden chair sits in the center. No cushion, no backrest. Just a plank with arm loops and head straps to keep customers still during, well, anything. The barber himself might be wearing a heavy linen apron stained from previous patrons. He is not a specialist in hairstyles. He is a man of utility, skilled in cutting hair, trimming beards, pulling teeth, and opening veins for bloodletting. You sit, and he grunts without much greeting. This is not a place of conversation or pampering. This is a place where you go to get things done to you. Barbers of medieval Europe were often the cheapest medical professionals available. They weren't trained like university physicians, who studied Latin texts and diagnosed illnesses based on astrology or bodily humors. Barber surgeons were closer to butchers with finesse. They worked quickly, often outdoors or in cramped quarters, and were expected to bleed, lance, shave, and amputate with the same tools and the same attitude. Want a haircut? That'll be a few coins. A shave? Add a little more. Need that aching tooth yank? Sit still and grit your teeth. You'll feel the same rusty blade that just shaved someone else's neckline scraping a longer. Gumline necks, sanitation. That concept hadn't fully arrived yet. Blades were wiped, not sterilized. Bowls were rinsed in cold water. Cloths were reused until they frayed apart. In a time when even physicians weren't sure how disease spread, barber surgeons worked on dozens of people in a day with no gloves, no disinfectant, no sense of microbial danger. In some places, the barber's services included bloodletting, one of the most popular treatments in Europe for nearly everything, from headaches to gout to depression. The logic came from Galenic medicine. You needed balanced humors, and excess blood was considered dangerous. So, the barber would slice open a vein in your forearm using a lancet, collect the blood in a bowl, and stop the bleeding with dirty linen bandages. And that red and white pole, it wasn't decorative. The red spiral represented blood, the white symbolized the bandages, and sometimes a brass basin sat on top or bottom to represent the bleeding bowl. That pole was both an advertisement and a warning. Haircuts weren't safe either. Razors were often dull and unbalanced. Scalp infections, ringworm, lice, even abscesses were common. And in a world without shampoo or antiseptics, tiny nicks during a shave could become infected, fester, and even lead to death. Then there were the fashions. Depending on the century and region, styles changed, but rarely for comfort. Men might have half their head shaved, while the remaining hair was grown long and oiled with goose fat. Religious mandates sometimes dictated hairstyles, especially for clergy. Tonsure style, where the top of the head was shaved bald and the sides left to grow, was common for monks. It was meant to symbolize humility, but often just left the scalp open to sunburn and lice. For women, things were no easier. They didn't go to barbers, but they were expected to keep their hair tightly bound, covered, or plucked at the forehead to create a fashionable highbrow. Hair was associated with morality. Loose hair could signify sinfulness in some towns. Widows were made to shave their heads in public. In others, a married woman who let her hair show might be punished by law. Back in the barber shop, as your head is scraped clean with a curved razor and your beard trimmed with iron scissors, you can't help but notice how everyone looks slightly injured after their visit. Red marks on the cheeks, scabs on the scalp, a wince when speaking. And still, people return, because this was grooming in the Middle Ages, painful, risky, and deeply social for some, especially in cities. The barber shop was a gathering place. It was where gossip spread, where deals were whispered, and where news was exchanged. One could come for a beard trim and leave with knowledge of who was marrying whom, who was dying of fever, or what the priest had preached that morning. In that way, the barber shop offered something valuable, a place to feel human, even while enduring unspeakably inhumane treatments. And so, as you rub your sore jaw and run your fingers over your newly jagged haircut, you wonder, if grooming was this painful, what did people do when they really got sick? You return to the medieval barber shop not as a guest, but as a patient. Though no one calls it that yet, the hair is gone, your scalp freshly scraped. But the real business begins now, and this time, the barber is more than a man with scissors. He is surgeon, dentist, and bloodletter, and you're here not just to be trimmed, but drained. Your arm is tied with a linen strip, and a slender iron lancet flashes through the dim light before you can object. Blood splashes into a shallow basin that smells of metal and old sweat. You're told this will ease your aches and rebalance your humors, though you're not entirely sure what that means. If you're unlucky, you might reach for a leech next, stored in a grimy jar that chirps slightly as the lid opens. He presses it behind your ear, murmuring that it will draw out bad blood. Around you, the shop groans with the sound of whetstones sharpening razors, the distant laughter of onlookers who treat each procedure like theater, and the hacking cough of someone waiting for a boil to be lanced. The air is thick with smoke, lye soap, and the musky reek of old skin oils, mingling in a way that makes your stomach churn. There's sawdust on the floor to soak up blood and grease, but it also stirs clouds of filth into the air, bits of skin, lice, flea dirt, and the dander of every soul who's passed through this chair. Infection is not understood here. The term germs means nothing. If you fall ill, they'll say it was foul air or punishment from God. You glance at the tools, blunt shears that tear more than cut, curved razors with flaking handles, and the cautery iron or rod of blackened iron heated in the hearth until it glows red. That, you realize with quiet horror, is for wounds that refuse to close. Even lice combs are shared among clients without washing, transferring infestations in seconds. Barbers, unlike the university-trained physicians, lack formal education, but they have something more terrifying: experience. They work fast, and they're popular because they're cheap, and yet they are mistrusted by surgeons, scorned by physicians, and envied by apothecaries. Disputes between these professions boil into open rivalry in cities like London and Paris. Barber guilds emerge, attempting to regulate who is allowed to cut and who may cure. But enforcement is uneven, and most villages simply trust whoever has the steadiest hand. You're told your haircut is done, but now he's smearing your scalp with vinegar, then with a lard-based paste infused with herbs to soothe the skin, though it stings like fire. You may be sold a powder to sprinkle over the next few. Night Salem, it's called, and while it tightens the skin, it can burn into the flesh if applied deliberately. You'll be advised to chew willow bark for the pain or drink beer steeped with henbane, a sedative that might also make you hallucinate. You've paid in coin, but you leave lighter in blood and spirit. 2. Out on the street, someone watches you cradle your arm and laughs, saying the barber nearly took your elbow. You laugh back nervously, wondering how many others walked in for a haircut and never walked back out. There is no mirror, but you can feel the welt forming behind your ear, where the flea comb caught your skin. You scratch it absently and hope it doesn't fester, for all the spectacle. The barber shop is not a place of care, it is a theater of controlled trauma. And as you make your way home through streets of dung and ash, you wonder, how long did this go on before someone, somewhere, finally questioned whether bleeding and burning were the only answers? You return to the barber shop a final time, not to endure another procedure, but to understand how, after centuries of bloodletting and guesswork, such places began to transform. It starts quietly, in places you wouldn't expect. In some cities, barber surgeons are formally separated from the physicians and given a clear distinction. Barbers cut hair, surgeons cut flesh, but the lines blur constantly, especially in towns. Too small for such hierarchy. Gradually, the influence of the Renaissance creeps in, one anatomical drawing at a time. Translations of ancient Greek and Arabic texts enter circulation, and a handful of curious minds begin to ask whether disease might come not from spirits or imbalance, but from something tangible, something inside the body itself. Human dissection, once legal and considered desecration, is allowed in some universities for educational purposes. Surgeons learn, slowly, how organs connect and how infections spread. A new wave of barber surgeons emerges, men like Ambroise Paré in the 16th century who challenged brutal practices like pouring boiling oil into wounds. Paré, himself trained as a barber, pioneers more gentle surgical techniques, and his writings influence future generations. Yet for every enlightened innovator, 1,000 rural barbers keep bleeding the sick with dirty blades, clinging to tradition. In England, a major shift comes in 1540 when King Henry VIII officially merges the Company of Barbers with the Guild of Surgeons. For a time, barbers are permitted to perform surgery under specific regulations, but by the mid-1700s, the professions split permanently as surgeons become fully recognized medical practitioners. Barbers are pushed back toward their original trade: shaving, grooming, and minor cosmetic care. The red and white barber pole, once a literal advertisement for bloodletting, remains as a symbolic echo. Its spiraling stripes recall the days when blood and bandages twirled together in the breeze. With the rise of germ theory in the 19th century, led by the likes of Pasteur and Lister, cleanliness becomes more than superstition. Sterilization, hand washing, and antiseptics begin saving lives where once only prayers and vinegar stood a chance. The barber shop, once a place where you risked sepsis for a shave, becomes instead a haven of polished mirrors and idle talk. By the time the 20th century arrives, the horrors of medieval cutting chairs are mostly forgotten, buried beneath layers of pomade and aftershave. And yet, the tools remain familiar: shears, razors, combs, and the chair is still there, only now it reclines comfortably under electric lighting. You sit in it today, perhaps, without ever knowing that centuries ago, this same seat meant blood loss, infection, and the gamble of survival. The hum of clippers replaces the rasp of whetstones, but in that quiet, as the scissors snip rhythmically near your ears, it's worth wondering how much of what we accept as harmless tradition today might, centuries from now, seem just as barbaric. How peasants used to fake illness to survive winter. You are in a thatched cottage, in the cold heart of a medieval winter, and outside, the wind claws at the shutters like a living thing inside. It is scarcely warmer. The hearth fire has gone to embers, the walls weep with condensation, and the rushes on the floor are soaked with the droppings of mice and last week's stew. Your breath fogs in the air. You are not a noble or a merchant, not even a craftsman. You are one of the many land-tied, hungry, and expendable. Food is running low. The grain stores are nearly empty. The salted pork was gone before mid-January, and your family shares one woolen tunic between them. The winter hunger is not sudden. It arrives in stages, like a slow illness. First, your hands go numb. Then your thoughts do. Then you begin to look at your neighbors differently. And as the church bells toll faintly in the distance, signaling another feast day you cannot afford to celebrate, a thought takes root. If you can convince the reeve, the local steward of the Lord's estate, that you are unfit for labor, you might be excused from the worst of the tasks. That excuse could be the difference between death and survival. This is not laziness nor cowardice. It is strategy. The medieval world is brutal toward the idle, but also surprisingly permissive toward the infirm. Illness is feared, often attributed to divine punishment or demonic influence. And where there is fear, there is opportunity. You remember how old Marjorie, half blind and full of tales, survived 3 winters longer than expected simply by shuffling, with a limp she never quite explained. You remember how young Matthew smeared chicken droppings on his chest and called it leprosy, until the bailiff turned pale and refused to come near. These stories pass from mouth to mouth like folk magic, not quite deception, not quite faith, but something in between. You practice a cough that sounds wet and convincing. You walk in circles until your cheeks are flushed with false fever. You murmur to the local priest that your dreams are full of black dogs and fire, hoping he will declare you spiritually unfit for work. Your mother scolds you for playing games with God, but does not stop you. Everyone understands the game. Some try more elaborate tricks. A woman in a nearby hamlet faked possession, throwing herself into the snow and babbling Latin she picked up at Mass. A man claimed he saw Saint Apollonia in the frost on his window pane and refused to eat anything but roots for a month, earning the pity of 3 households. Illness in the Middle Ages is not defined by doctors, it is judged by neighbors, by priests, and by whoever controls the grain. If you can appear convincingly weak, you might be permitted to rest indoors rather than carry frozen dung to the fields. You might be given broth, a crust of black bread, a blanket, but the risk is real. Pretending to well could land you in the care of a barber surgeon, who will bleed you with a rusted knife. Or worse, a priest may suspect demonic possession and summon the bishop. Then it's holy water, fasting, and prayer vigils you are unlikely to survive. This balance between visible suffering and invisible cunning is something peasants have learned over centuries, passed down like recipes or lullabies. The nobleman may rule the land, but he does not know what it is to outlive winter on lies and half-buried turnips. And so you shiver near the fire and wonder, as the snow creeps under the door, how far can you bend the truth before it bends you back? You wake to frost on your eyelashes, the hearth now cold, and a gnawing in your belly that feels more like memory than hunger. There is no meat, no grain, not even oat scraps left in the sack tied to the beam. Outside, the snow has hardened into a crust that cracks underfoot like old bone. You sit up slowly, remembering your role, the limp you adopted yesterday, the wheezing cough you've rehearsed to perfection. You make your way to the manor's edge where other villagers gather for daily assignments. Wrapped in every scrap of cloth they can find, the steward eyes you with suspicion. But you avert your gaze and double over with a low groan. It works for now. He sends you to the church porch to warm yourself, while others haul wood. This small victory is everything. You watch them labor in the biting cold while you press your hands against the stone walls, feeling some illusion of warmth, trying not to think about the price. No one here calls it faking. They use words like ailing, weakened, touched by the saints, or just not right since. Candlemas. They understand, perhaps better than the scribes in distant cities, that illness is a tool as much as a trial. Word spreads fast when someone manages to dodge a hard chore. Children observe and mimic walking stiff-legged or crossing their eyes, learning early that the line between survival and starvation is often drawn with theater. But not all performances succeed. Last month, a boy tried to imitate palsy by shaking at the table and spilling his pottage. The reeve caught wind and ordered him strapped to the yoke cart for disrespecting the infirm. He limped for real after that. You carry that image with you, practicing subtlety. Your cough must sound worse at dawn and fade by evening. You must feign dizziness when lifting your sack, but recover quickly enough not to arouse too much interest. You speak to the midwife, Agnes, who's seen every real ailment in the village and suspects every false one too. But she's not unkind. She offers you a mixture of vinegar, dried mint, and pig fat to rub on your chest. For the look of it, she says with a knowing glance, if you're going to act ill, at least smell the part. There are those in the village who disapprove. The devout say that pretending illness tempts divine wrath. They remind others of saints who suffered joyfully, wearing chains or sleeping in ashes. You nod respectfully, but wonder whether saints ever had to share a bed with lice and a coughing uncle in a house with no chimney. Some villagers aren't pretending at all. The elderly, the weak, the ones with ague or dropsy they waste away in corners of cottages. visited only by flies and the priest. And yet even among the truly sick, a performance is required. If you don't look ill enough, if your fever doesn't show, if your limbs don't shake people doubt, you must perform your suffering to receive charity. Whether real or imagined, even within monasteries, where hospitality is a sacred duty, the truly sick are sometimes denied because they are too quiet, too clean, too composed. So illness, in this world, is not a diagnosis. It is a role cast by need and played under the eyes of neighbors who are both your audience and your judge. There's no physician with spectacles and books in your village. There's no record of what you're trying to do, no ink note of your false fever, no parchment confession. Just the memory of who got away with it last winter and who didn't. You lean against the stones, eyes half shut, practicing stillness as the snow begins again. And you begin to wonder, how much longer can you keep this up? And what happens when someone truly needs help but no one believes them? The thaw comes late this year. The snow retreats with reluctance, leaving behind puddles that reek of rot and filth, and fields that squelch beneath bare feet. Hunger doesn't disappear with winter, it simply changes shape. Now it is mud in your bread and mildew in your bed straw. The coughing that once served you well has become real. A raw burn in your throat that doesn't quiet when the steward turns away. You are not sure if you've crossed from pretending to truth, or if you've simply convinced yourself to well. In the village, people are emerging with sunken eyes and bent backs. Not all of them survivors. Old Marjorie is dead. The priest says she passed in her sleep, but some whisper that she stopped eating after her son was conscripted. The boy who faked palsy no longer limps, but his eyes dart constantly, watching for punishment that might return. Around you, talk shifts from illness to work again. The planting must begin. The manor fields wait. You are summoned with the others, and your name is read from the steward's list with no mention of your long-standing affliction. There is no room now for frailty. The fiction you built around your bones has outlived its usefulness, and you return to the rows of earth with blistered hands and a head full of questions. One day, you catch your reflection in a pool, your eyes sunken, your cheeks hollow. You wonder whether you were ever acting. Maybe the lines between health and sickness were always thinner than anyone realized. The healer Agnes tells you about a woman she once knew who convinced herself she was dying so thoroughly that her heart simply stopped one morning like a bird struck silent. You ask her if pretending can make something real. She nods slowly, staring at her bundle of dried herbs. Everything becomes real if you carry it long enough, she says. And so you carry on carrying tools, lies, memories. The trick of survival hasn't ended. It has only changed shape. Now it's in your gait, the silence you maintain, the careful stories you don't tell around the hearth. You wonder, quietly, how many around you have survived not because they were strong, but because they learned to appear fragile at the right moment. How many were spared by a false cough, a practiced limp, a bit of borrowed pity? And as you walk home from the fields, sore but upright, you ask yourself the question that never gets written into the history books. In a world where survival means suffering, is it better to be brave or just believable? The gross truth about medieval tooth care. You wake in the dim morning light of a medieval village, and the first thing you taste is your own breath, stale, sour, and oddly metallic. There is no toothbrush. There is no running water. No mini foam or pleasant rinse to look forward to. You are one of countless villagers who begin their day with teeth that ache, blacken, or feel loose in their gums. But you aren't alone, and your mouth isn't neglected because you don't care, it's neglected because the concept of dental hygiene as a daily ritual simply doesn't exist. Instead, care of the teeth in this time is a patchwork of superstition, folk wisdom, herbal remedies, and desperate measures. If you were lucky enough to be born into a family of means or a monastery with good records, you might have access to rudimentary tooth powders, often made from ground charcoal, burnt rosemary, crushed eggshells, and salt. Sometimes they add mint if it's in season, or sage. though no one is quite sure if the plants cleanse or simply cover up the rot. If you are a peasant, your dental routine is simpler. You chew on twigs, particularly from trees like hazel or ash, which are thought to strengthen the gums. Sometimes, people rub their teeth with a cloth dipped in wine or vinegar. The taste is sharp, the cloth rough, but there is a strange logic to it. Vinegar is cleansing, after all, and wine, especially the strong stuff, can numb the ache of a decaying molar. Teeth were seen not as a private concern, but as a visible part of one's character. A clean mouth was associated with spiritual health. Dirty teeth, particularly if accompanied by a foul smell, were sometimes thought to be a sign of inner corruption. You've heard the parish priest describe halitosis as the breath of the sinful, and so people go to great lengths to mask or treat bad breath not just for comfort, but for salvation. Cloves, fennel seeds, and parsley are chewed regularly, not because they cure anything, but because they make you more tolerable in conversation and prayer. The rich might rinse with honeyed water, sometimes mixed with wine and rosemary, swirling it like an elixir. But honey attracts flies, and wine stings in open gums. You've seen men cry out when rinsing with ale gone sour. When a tooth aches persistently, there is one recourse: the barber surgeon. You walk to the market square, where his red and white pole spins in the wind, a symbol of blood and bandages. Tooth pulling is a side business, often done on a stool with a prayer and a dirty iron tool. There is no anesthesia, only of friends, hand to grip, and maybe a rag to bite. Many people die not from the tooth itself, but from what comes after: infection, sepsis, or a jawbone that will not heal. Some turn instead to charms. A common one involves wearing a dead mole's tooth around the neck to ward off decay. Another requires reciting a particular psalm 3 times while spitting over the left shoulder. You've tried both. Neither work. The worst pain, though, isn't the sharp stab of a rotting tooth, it's the slow, constant throb that wears you down. That sours every meal and makes bread feel like glass. Meals, of course, don't help. You chew through coarse rye bread, gruel thick with grit from grinding stones, and salted meat so hard it can crack an incisor. Fresh fruits are rare, sugar is almost non-existent, and scurvy creeps in silently. Behind the gums, you notice your breath has a sweetness to it now. Not the pleasant kind, but the sweet rot of something wrong. And you wonder if everyone around you smells the same, tastes the same decay, and wakes with the same dull ache. How would anyone even know what a healthy mouth is supposed to feel like? Your jaw has begun to swell. You try not to touch it, but the skin there is warm and tender, as if your face is nursing a secret it refuses to confess. You chew on the other side of your mouth now, favoring soft foods when you can find the milk-soaked bread, bits of stewed onion, whatever soft root the kitchen hasn't yet turned into pig feed. In this village, you are not alone in your pain. The baker's wife is missing a row of lower teeth and carries a perpetual grimace. The priest's breath could wilt the ivy growing on the chapel walls. Even the Lord Steward, clean-shaven and self-important, speaks with a lisp you now recognize as the absence of his back molars. You start to notice the signs everywhere: twisted lips, uneven cheeks, little involuntary flinches when laughter hits a nerve. Pain is the common thread of this century, sewn into mouths just as it is into backs and bellies. Some try to fight it with remedies passed down like prayers. There's a poultice made from boiled leeks and wine vinegar wrapped in cloth and tied against the cheek to draw out the demon. Others chew on myrrh or hold cloves between their teeth, not only to mask the smell, but to numb the nerve endings. The church has its own suggestions: holy water sprinkled directly into the mouth, while reciting the prayer of Saint Apollonia, patroness of toothaches, who legend says had all her teeth shattered before martyrdom. Her image is painted on a board in the nave, holding a tooth in a pair of iron tongs. People kneel before her with their jaws clenched tight, not from reverence, but agony. Still others resort to more desperate methods. A local widow swears by a drink made from mashed frog liver and ground pearls, though few can afford either ingredient. And there's always the bone tooth powder scraped from skulls exhumed in secret. And mixed with goose fat, you've heard the apothecary whisper it to only his boldest clients. But none of this works for long. Pain returns, always. You begin to understand why some simply give up. You've seen people tie strips of cloth around their faces, not to hold on to their teeth, but to bind them shut so they don't have to talk or eat. You've watched people lose speech, appetite, even temper, as the infection climbs from tooth to sinus to brain. At night, you find yourself grinding your teeth in your sleep in the silence. You can hear others doing the same, a chorus of unconscious agony. There's a girl in the village, about 12, with perfectly white teeth. She rarely speaks, but when she does, it's like a miracle. People ask her what she does, and she only shrugs. Her mother says she rubs her teeth with crushed mint leaves every morning. That's all. And maybe it is, or maybe she is simply young, or blessed, or hasn't yet tasted the meat that will break her first molar. You look at your own reflection. In a puddle again, your gums puffy, your lips dry, and you wonder if so many around you suffer the same fate, and if no one really understands what causes it. What exactly is considered normal? Is pain simply part of the design? The pain breaks one night while you're sleeping, not slowly, not subtly, but like thunder cracking inside your skull. You wake with your hand pressed to your cheek and find blood on your fingers. The tooth has split, or perhaps dislodged it. Hard to say. There is relief at first, strangely enough, like a boil finally lanced. But then comes the taste. Metal and raw, sour and thick, spreading with each breath. You stagger outside to rinse your mouth with the rainwater that collects. In the barrel by the doorway, the cold numbs your gums, and for a moment you kneel there, dizzy, grateful, dripping. It's only then that you remember what others have warned about. When a tooth breaks this way, it's not the end of the suffering, it's only the beginning of the waiting. Will the flesh swell again? Will the pain return? Or will the jaw turn black? The eye weep pus, the fever rise. There's no doctor in this village. The barber left weeks ago, and the apothecary now trades only for grain. You think about walking to the next town, but even that idea hurts. Instead, you chew clove stuffed linen and lie still in the dark, listening to the night sounds around you, soft snoring, the crackle of the hearth, a cough far off in the dormitory. In the morning, your mouth is still bleeding, but the pain has dulled into something livable. You drink a thin gruel and speak little. Your neighbor gives you a remedy scrawled on a scrap of parchment, a mix of crushed wormwood and sheep's urine. You don't try it. The parchment smells like mold. A week passes, then two. You survive. The hole in your gum scars over like so many others, and you realize so much of life here is about losing parts of yourself and simply continuing. One tooth, one finger, one child. Each loss is folded into the routine like flour into dough, and eventually, what you're left with is still called a life, even if it has fewer pieces than before. Some say the nobles didn't suffer like this, that they had gold toothpicks and imported herbs from Iberia. Maybe that's true, but even they, with all their perfumes and pastes, still died young, still rotted in the ground, still left skulls with missing teeth. You wonder what your own will look like someday. Centuries from now, will someone find it and guess that you were poor, malnourished, neglected? Or will they look at your jaw and see something familiar, something human, worn down by time and hunger and quiet perseverance? Maybe dental pain was never just a physical problem. Maybe it was always a mirror showing people who they really were when no one could help them, when survival meant bearing the unbearable. You lie back on the straw mattress and trace your tongue along the broken edge of gum. Still tender, still real. And you ask yourself the question that lingers beneath every unspoken ache in history. Did people survive because they endured pain or because they had no other choice? The bizarre daily schedule of a medieval monk's sun hasn't yet risen, but the monastery stirs like a beast in the dark. You are already awake, though not because you wanted to be. The bell in the tower clanged sometime after midnight, summoning. Every soul behind these cold stone walls to vigils, the first of 8 daily prayers. You rise without words. Talking is not forbidden, but it is discouraged, and after a while, silence becomes habit. The air is cold, and your feet find the stone floor without needing to see it. You've done this before, many times. You pull on your woolen robe rough, unwind, a shade of brown that hides soot and food stains alike, and join the slow procession to the chapel. You walk with other monks, all of you ghost-like in the half-light, heads bowed more out of fatigue than reverence. At vigils, you chant psalms in Latin, many of which you do not fully understand. You try to stay awake, try to pronounce the syllables clearly, but your mouth moves almost automatically now. The words are muscle memory. By the time you return to your cell, it is still night. You might get a few minutes of sleep before the bell rings again for lauds, just before dawn. And so the day begins not with breakfast or light conversation, but with chanting, bowing, and the quiet sense that your body no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the rule. The rule of Saint Benedict governs every hour, and in this monastery, there is no room for improvisation. After lauds, you wash your hands and face using cold water from a basin shared with 5 other monks. There is no soap, just a rag, worn thin from use. You're allowed a small meal now, called collation, bread, a bit of dried fruit if the season is kind, and perhaps a soft cheese. If it was your turn to skim the cream the day before, you eat in silence while a younger monk reads aloud from scripture. You try to listen, but your thoughts drift to the cold, to the itch beneath your robe, to the sensation of hunger that never quite disappears. After breakfast, it is time for prime, the next prayer. More chanting than labor. Each monk has a duty, tending the gardens, copying manuscripts, baking bread, or if you're unlucky, scrubbing the privy trenches behind the latrines. You were assigned to the scriptorium last month, and your eyes still ache from hours hunched over vellum. Today it is your turn in the herb garden. You work with another monk, Brother Peter, whose back is always curved like a question mark. He speaks only in nods. You plant fennel and thyme, scrape weeds from between stones, and brush frost from the leaves of cabbages growing along the wall. The work is not hard, but it is repetitive and cold. Your fingers turn numb, then red, then slightly purple, at terse. You stop again to pray, always to pray. This rhythm repeats, as unchanging as the bells themselves. Work, pray, eat, work, pray, sleep, though sleep never comes in a long stretch. You nap in slivers, fitting rest between the tolling of the hours. Midday brings sext, followed by the main meal. It is served in silence in the refectorium. You sit with your back straight on a narrow bench and bow your head before touching your food. A single plate holds gruel thickened with barley, a scoop of lentils, and sometimes, if the abbot is feeling generous, another wedge of that same sharp, crumbly cheese. Wine is permitted, but watered down. Meat is only allowed on special feast days or when you're ill and you're not quite ready to feign sickness just yet. The voice of the lector continues through lunch, reading now from the lives of saints or a theological tract written so long ago. It barely makes sense. You hear the syllables, but not the meaning. Your teeth crunch something hard and the gruel may be a grain of sand, maybe a stone. You do not spit it out. After lunch, you scrub your own bowl and return it to the shelf. There is no personal property in the monastery. Even your robe was worn by someone else before you. You are not Brother Thomas or Brother Elias anymore. You are simply a monk, one cell in a body that has existed for centuries. As you walk back to the garden for more labor, the sun finally warms the walls, casting shadows across the gravel paths. You wonder, how long could a person live like this before forgetting they had ever lived another way? The afternoon unfolds with the quiet slowness that defines monastic life. You return to the garden and pull weeds until your knees ache, dirt settling under your fingernails like a second skin. The sun rises high, but you hardly notice. There are no clocks here, only bells and shadows. Eventually, The bell rings for none. The mid-afternoon prayer. You wash your hands again, cold water. Same cracked bowl and join the others in the chapel, where the same psalms you chanted before are now repeated in different configurations. There is comfort in the repetition, even if your voice strains to match the others. Once prayer's in, you file into the scriptorium. Even if you're not a skilled scribe, you're expected to help in the production of manuscripts. You sharpen quills, grinding from oak galls, scrape vellum with a knife until it's smooth. The smell of parchment and lamp oil fills the room. Elder monks stoop over writing desks, eyes narrowed, hands steady. Illuminators whisper to themselves as they paint delicate vines and strange creatures in the margins. You're tasked with trimming the edges of a page and copying a passage from the Book of Psalms. You know it by heart, but still you copy it slowly, making each letter exact, each line straight. One mistake means starting over. A single blotch of ink could ruin days of work. There is no speaking except for the occasional grunt of frustration or the clearing of a throat. It is a sacred silence, not out of fear or scolding, but because the act of writing is itself considered a kind of prayer. You lose track of time as the words spill from your hand in loops and slashes, and the room grows dim with the weight of late afternoon. When the bell for vespers rings, your fingers are stiff and ink-stained. You rise and stretch, knees cracking, and file out once more for prayers. Vespers is longer than the others. Candles flicker on the altar. Your eyes wander the chapel walls, pausing on the faded frescoes of saints and demons, some nearly invisible now beneath centuries of soot. The abbot's voice rises and falls with ritual certainty, and you mouth the responses almost unconsciously. Afterward comes a brief supper, lighter than the midday meal, maybe more bread, some vegetable stew, and always the same hard cheese, slightly sour, and smelling faintly of the cellar. It is said that monks shouldn't live to eat, and that's easy enough when the food never varies. After dinner, there is one last moment of daylight for walking the cloister walk in silence. You take slow steps, listening to your own breathing echo off the stones. You think about how every day here is like this, identical yet subtly different, shaped by the mood of the sky or the murmur of a brother's voice during prayer. Monastic life is not built around excitement or ambition, but surrendering your ego, your desires, your old name. You're not forbidden from speaking, but over time, you lose the urge. Words become unnecessary when the rhythm of the day says everything for you, and yet, sometimes a thought breaks through the stillness like a shout in a library. Today, it is this. How long before you forget what day it is? How long before time itself becomes meaningless, not because you're lost, but because you're finally found in the hours? Compline is the last prayer of the day. It arrives not with fanfare, but with a bell's low, familiar call, resigned and heavy, like a breath let out at the end of a long confession. You walk with the others beneath a navy sky, the last of the daylight dying on the cloister walls. The chapel glows with candle light, and the shadows of the monks move as one. A sea of hoods and hunched shoulders. You kneel, chant, cross yourself, and then bow your head in a silence that now feels more like comfort than deprivation. After the final amen, you do not speak. It is the great silence, lasting until dawn. The monastery does not require it to be absolute, but in practice, it becomes so. Words become burdensome by nightfall, unnecessary clutter in a space now reserved for dreams and contemplation. You walk slowly to your cell, passing doors that all look alike, each monk's space barely wider than an arm span, furnished with only a cot, a prayer stool, a small wooden cross. You close the door behind you and settle onto the straw mattress. It smells faintly of old wool and dust, but you hardly notice anymore. You loosen your belt, fold your robe at the foot of the bed, and lie down fully clothed, your back against the chill wall, your hands folded on your chest like a tomb carving. You do not pray aloud. Prayer now feels internal, humming quietly beneath your thoughts like a low drone of bees. You think of nothing and everything. The psalms you recited, and the morning drift back to you in fragments, stitched into the very rhythm of your breath. You hear owls outside. You hear a brother coughing in a nearby cell, soft and repetitive. You hear the wind tickling the shutter slats. You do not sleep yet. Your body is still humming with the structure of the day. And in that stillness, a question comes, one you would never voice, but one that clings to the quiet corners of your mind nonetheless. If you had never entered this place, never traded your name, your family, your old life, who would you have become? Not holier, perhaps, not wiser or freer, but something else entirely. Out there, life is messy and chaotic and often short. But here, behind these walls, it is deliberate. Every hour has its reason. Every day folds into the next like pages of the same psalter. You do not know if this life is better or worse, only that it is quieter, and that in this quiet you have forgotten the sound of your own voice. You close your eyes. Morning will come again, vigils, lauds, cheese, and silence, and maybe that's all life is now. A loop without end, where the sacred hides not in miracles, but in the simple act of waking to do it all again.